Good day and welcome to Westchester Talk Radio. I'm John Marino and we are WestchesterTalkRadio.com. Made possible by our good friends at Entergy, the Indian Point Energy Center, and we are produced by Sharc, S-H-A-R-C, and that's Sharc with a C, not a K, Creative, and also made possible by Lipolis Electric. At Lipolis, you are never left in the dark. At Entergy in Buchanan, the Indian Point Energy Center, they promise to keep powering us up right through April of 2021. And Hightower Westchester, at Hightower, they manage our wealth to a fiduciary standard. Here on the Cup of Joe Political Show, we are joined by Westchester County Legislator Christopher Johnson. Christopher Johnson represents the 16th District in the city of Yonkers. Christopher Johnson, thank you for joining us today here on Westchester Talk Radio. I want to talk the all-important issue now of social justice, which is on everybody's mind. It's in the forefront, pretty much everything we do now. And I want to start off simply by saying this. Do we need incidents like Minneapolis and Atlanta to shake us up and to finally get people going? What's taken so long? And do you think we're past the stage of finally past the stage of looking at something, kind of looking over the shoulder and saying, that's not right, and then we just keep going on with our lives and our business until the next incident happens again?
So first, thank you for having me, and I'm glad that we're having this discussion. I think this is, central to, obviously to the moment, but a continued conversation that I think we need to continue having. And I think that speaks to your question. Unfortunately, I just think we live in a society where the news cycles in and out, right? And so whatever is in front of us at the moment really grabs our attention, and that's what we want to really talk to and what we want to make changes about. And that's what drives us in that moment. And so unfortunately, I do think that this moment will pass. And so we're going to get as much as we can out of this moment. People will fight for great legislative ideas to pass, changes in budgets, changes in policies from all different types of law enforcement agencies. But at some point, something else will happen. I told people at some rallies that once COVID kind of starts to wrap up and people go back to work and they get back into a daily kind of schedule and a rhythm, that this will then be passed, and this will be in our rearview mirrors. And so we need to do what we can in this moment to make the changes that we need. So when we get there, it's a more just, equitable place.
Do you think that had COVID not hit and Atlanta happened, Minneapolis happened, the attention on all of this would not be what it has been? Had we been in our daily lives every day just doing what we normally do? Unfortunately,
absolutely. George Floyd was not the first. And unfortunately, we already know he's not the last. We've seen incidents come and go from a 12-year-old boy, Tamir Rice. A cop car drives up and shoots and kills him, no questions asked. And there were no riots in the street.
Back. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this happens time after time after time. And, there may be some discussion in those cities and those municipalities. It may make national news for one night or two, but after that, then it's on to back to our regularly scheduled lives. And so with COVID, everyone was forced, after they finished watching all their favorite Netflix series and watching everything they had on their DVR, watching the news, and George Floyd's death was all over the news, and that's what was being covered. And people had to really look at it and watch it and come to terms with what this nation has always been. And so unfortunately, fortunately, we've been able to make some gains in the last, few months, but unfortunately, this time will pass.
We've had Louisville, we had Colorado, and more. You said you think this time is passing. There has been talk that it already has been passing. How do we stay focused on this issue and make sure it doesn't pass, no matter how much back into our regular normal lives we get post-COVID, or as we try to move post-COVID? What do we have to do to keep this in the forefront?
Unfortunately, I think that those who feel most victimized, and Black people and other people of color, have gotten some kind of recognition in this time, right? And so we've seen a lot of people get promotions that they wouldn't have necessarily have gotten before. They deserved it, but they wouldn't have even been looked at. And so now they're in these positions that they deserved, but they necessarily would not have had. But now there's an extra pressure and added pressure on them. So now that they're in this position, obviously to perform, whatever your workplace is, but also to make sure that your colleagues understand that the disproportionate negative effect that they have put on you, and that you've been exposed to your entire lifetime. And so if you are, a Black person who's gotten a promotion at a law firm, it's your responsibility to make sure that your colleagues as lawyers understand that your struggle is different from theirs, and that you have to work, and there are times where you have to work twice as hard as they have to just to get half of what they have. And so it's incumbent upon us, people like me in elected office, to make sure that we keep this at the forefront of our discussions.
Let's get into some of those issues that lead to communities of color and other communities too maybe staying in poverty for decades where they shouldn't be. How do we break vicious cycles like, say, for example, the poverty we've seen for so many years in so many different communities? How do we get our elected officials like you, for example, to institute programs to help people get out of generations of poverty and generations of different problems that seem to just sweep up entire areas?
So that is a deep question, right? That I don't think we have all the time for, but there are a myriad of issues, right? So my first issue that is deepest and nearest to my heart, which I don't necessarily have an effect on at the county level, is education. And so unfortunately in this country, the zip code that you're born in decides whether or not you'll get a good education. And that is abhorrent, right? It should never be that way. I represent Yonkers. And a portion of Yonkers in Westchester County. And there is a clear difference in the education of children who live in Yonkers, born and raised in Yonkers, versus children who live in other communities in Westchester, the Scarsdales, the Hartsdales, even the Yorktowns and things like that up county. There's a stark difference in the education, and it has nothing to do with whether or not these children are able or capable. It should not have anything to do with the color of their skin or their gender or anything like that. It literally is limited to the fact that they come from a poor neighborhood and therefore receive a substandard education.
And so why is that? Why do they get substandard educations? What's the problem?
So a lot of this it goes back to how the state funds our school districts. I was on a call actually last night with several local elected officials talking about how the 20% cut to education because of COVID sounds equitable, because, if we're going to get a 20% cut across the board, that means that every single school district will get 20% of their state aid cut. But if you're at Scarsdale and, 10%, I actually don't know what exactly the percentage is, but if 10% of your funding comes from state aid, then you're getting a 2% cut, right? But if you're the city of Yonkers and half of your funding comes from state aid, a 20% cut means that 10% of your funding right away is gone. Right. And that number is a much bigger number.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's educational death, basically, is what it is at that point.
Exactly.
Could we go to a system where maybe the Scarsdales get cut 20%, just using that as an arbitrary figure, and maybe a Yonkers gets cut 10%? Even then, the balance might still not be the same. But at least where Scarsdale, a place like that, there are different community clubs and educational clubs through the school, and parents and teachers associations, et cetera, and athletic clubs, for example, for the different sports teams that can raise funds. Whereas in Yonkers, and I'm somebody that works a lot of public address around different high school athletic events around the county. I've done that for many years. And you see the more affluent areas have so many different clubs, different ways to fund. And you go to the city of Yonkers and you talk to people like, where's the money? We don't get anything. We don't have any money. Therefore, we can't do anything for our kids.
Right. And it's a shame. And it is large part. It is in large part due to the fact that it is a lower income community. And unfortunately, when people they look at school districts when they think about buying property, and so people don't want their property taxes to go up if they don't have their kids in the schools. And a lot of the property owners in Yonkers send their children to private schools, and so they don't want to see, they don't care whether or not the public schools in Yonkers achieve. And the same thing in a city like Syracuse, who actually was the example that was presented on that phone call I mentioned. They were talking about their school district, and it is literally a problem that we see all across this nation, where communities that are impoverished don't have that access to education that other communities do. And we know that education is one of those ways in which individuals can get themselves out of poverty. Another thing we talk about is access to housing, right? So if you're not sure about where you're going to spend the night, then how can you think about how to do your homework? How can you focus when you're at work and be efficient at your job? And if you're not efficient at your job, then you're on the chopping block, right? So where and how someone lives, right? Their access to transportation and how they get to work. I mean, I can think about like my own life at this point. I am much more advantaged than I used to be. I have a 25-minute commute to work. Whereas when I was in college, I had a job in Manhattan and it was an hour ride on the train. That is an extra hour in my day that I now can use towards something else, whether it be leisure, whether it be giving back to my community and doing volunteer work, or whether it just be, spending time with my friends and watching YouTube, or spending time with the kids or the wife, or eating dinner. Just those things or cooking dinner, right? So then we talk about the difference in communities with what people eat. Because they're impoverished versus what people who have can do. And so little things like that people don't think about regularly really have a deep effect on the difference of how people live.
I know somebody in Cambria Heights, Queens. He teaches in the South Bronx, takes 3 buses just to get to the subway, and it's a 2.5-hour commute one way every day for him. Shows you how dedicated he is,
right,
with his craft and what he does to be able to put that in and to want to put that time in every day and still run a youth soccer program after school too. You talked about the effects of all of this and the effects of how, if let's say you live in an area where your kids go to private school, but you don't want to pay more taxes and you're not really that interested in funding the school system, the public school system where you live. I've always thought that even if you send your kids to private school, if you help fund your local public school system, that's for the benefit of everybody, including you.
Absolutely. Without a doubt. And I think people are often short-sighted, where we look at how much money can we get in our pocketbooks today, how much can we put in our wallet today, rather than thinking about the value of what is going on around us. So today you might get an extra $5, $10, $20, but if we look at what this means for us, 10 years down the line, it could mean several $100s of increased, property value. It could mean relationships with your neighbors, right? If you have neighbors that go to the public schools and your children go to private schools, they may not have that relationship, but now they can compete on the same level in education as well as in their after school extracurricular activities.
Discussing social justice here, Westchester Talk Radio with County Legislator Chris Johnson, 16th District, City of Yonkers. Chris Johnson, you touched on not maybe having the same place to sleep in or live your life in every night, especially for a student. The issue of homelessness, not getting better, it's getting worse. How do we attack this issue and get people off the streets, maybe into a facility where they could at least be on a winter's night, be safe, hopefully safe and warm? How do we get to the root causes of homelessness? If you don't have a job, you can't pay for any place to live in, you wind up without a humble abode.
So I think we have to first understand what homelessness looks like. And in Westchester County, we did the housing needs assessment to look at housing in Westchester, where the gaps are, and what the average homeowner looks like, or a home resident looks like in Westchester County. And what we found was that every community in Westchester has people that are basically stringing this together, piece by piece. And so that oftentimes we think about homeless individuals and we think about someone who has a mental health issue, or someone who is addicted to drugs. And that is a part of the homeless experience, unfortunately, and we definitely have a lot of work to do there. But the low-hanging fruit is affordable housing. The low-hanging fruit is, if you make $15 an hour, you can't get an apartment in Westchester County. It is extremely difficult to get an apartment in Westchester County. So the people who work at, the secretary at the business in White Plains, or the person who works at the bar in Portchester, how do they get to their job? from where they live because it's difficult for them to afford to live in the community that they work in. And so we have to really pay attention to that, right? So if you have a business in Scarsdale, where do your employees live, and how do they get to work? Because they may not be able to afford to live in Westchester. So if they have to come up from the Bronx, how long does that take them? What is their lifestyle like if they have to, do that? And then if they can't afford to live, to purchase a home or to have a residence, then they end up in our social services system. And so it is way less expensive to make sure that we house everybody and to give subsidies for housing than it is to pay for someone to have a hotel room or to be in a shelter overnight. And then we talk about the individuals who are abusing, drugs or other substances and need that type of assistance, and individuals with mental health issues. And so we have our mental health department at the county, which helps and reaches out to those individuals, but there's still so much work to be done.
You talk about employers and having someone who might have to travel from the Bronx, let's say, to central Westchester, even southern Westchester to get to work. You got to take a number of buses or a train or both to do that. I know people who do that as well. If I have, let's say, a business in a Scarsdale, a Hartsdale, a Hastings, for example, and I'm looking at somebody I really want to hire. They happen to live in the Bronx or a different part of Westchester that's far away. That could determine whether or not I hire that person too. I might go with somebody who's a lot more local, close to home.
Right, and because you would understand that person who's closer might be able to be more reliable. Not that they're a more reliable individual or that they're a better worker, but literally just because they live closer, they have the ability to get to their place of work in a more reliable fashion than taking several buses. But if you paid someone equitably, they could either live in the community that they need to, or they could purchase a vehicle that would allow them to traverse and get back and forth in a reasonable manner.
Mental health, another major issue. You touch upon that too. We seem to be heading in the wrong direction instead of the right direction with that. Why?
I think that we need to, another thing that we just need to look at differently, right? So because the brain is so complex and you can't just see, when someone breaks their leg, you see that, right? And the way to heal a broken leg is you put a cast on it, they put their leg up and they rest. Well, what happens when someone has a mental health break, right? You don't see that. It is much more difficult to put your hands on and touch and feel. And so we're not dealing with it in the same way. I mean, people talk about depression, and I think that it is, everybody has a moment when they are depressed, when they are down, when they are out and they feel that moment of despair. Everybody has a cold. We treat the cold, we treat a common cold, we treat the flu every year, we give a flu shot, but we don't treat depression in the same manner. Why not? Why doesn't everyone, we have the Department of Social Services, and every year when they come in front of us to discuss their budget, I ask the commissioner, is there an opportunity for these individuals who go into these situations that are extremely difficult? Do they have a place where they can deposit all of their feelings? Because if you go, every time you go into someone's home, they're in the lowest place in their life. Imagine the toll that takes on you. So imagine doing that job for 5, 10, 15 years. What does that do to your impression of these individuals who are in their darkest times? What does that do to your ability to emote and to reach them and sympathize and empathize with what they're going through? So we need to make sure that people have access to social workers, to therapy, and that's part of health insurance, right? That people have clear and consistent and open access to these opportunities, just as it is regular, as we have access to physical health.
You talk about how we can't see someone have a break mentally. We can see it physically. Someone can break mentally today, right now. You might not see the real true effects of that for 2 years down the road. So how do you deal with that person? You see the change, you're not sure, and yet 2 years down the road is when maybe they get involved in an incident that would have never happened if they were treated the right way. These are all, to me, connected issues that have to be addressed, and solutions have to be found to them somehow, and I don't think we seem to be totally interested as a society in really finding those solutions. If we had a financial problem and we wanted a solution, we'd make sure we took care of that, right? But if we have a social issue, that's a different story. It's like, that's going to go away. It'll be okay.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And but it's the same with a physical health issue, right? Someone can have a diagnosis that might not affect them physically today, but 2, 5, 10 years down the line, it can have true, real effects on their everyday living, and and it may physically actually show itself. So if people had the opportunity and the ability to have annual checkups with a mental health professional, and that was in their healthcare, imagine the changes that we would see.
We talked about schooling. I want to go back to that issue with schools seemingly ready to open up around New York State in a few weeks after the COVID pandemics. The effect on the state of New York, it's unspeakable the way it's affected the state, and it's not over, obviously. What do you see as effective schooling is what the right model should be when we get back to school? I know the governor wants communities individually around the state to put their own plan together. How do you see this happening in the city of Yonkers or around Westchester at the moment?
So Yonkers announced, I believe yesterday or very recently, that they're going to 100% virtual. And I think you the way you phrased your question, and I actually don't remember it exactly, but it's just not going to be equitable. It's not going to, and there's no good answers, right? I just don't think that you can expect children to sit in front of a screen and be focused on what a teacher is trying to explain and to teach them. And you may be able to expect that from, 10%, 15%, maybe 50% of your class, but there's no way if you're a teacher with 30 students that you're going to be able to show 30 individuals, via virtual reality, how to solve this math problem when they're in kindergarten, right? Like it's just extreme. The challenge is beyond anything that I think we're prepared for.
30 kids look at it 30 different ways, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And when you have a teacher and a teacher's aide in a lot of these, situations, then you can give, individual students that need that extra attention, some of that in the classroom. It's extremely difficult, if not, impossible to do that in a Zoom classroom, with the addition to the fact that we're talking about how some households are struggling with how they have the opportunity to use the technology. I have a friend who is an educator, and he's an English teacher, and he has his students, they have to finish their assignment before the end of the day, and that's how he takes attendance, by 3:00. And so he had one student reach out to him and said, "There are 5 of us in my household, and my dad has 1 laptop. I'm sorry, if I can't get the assignment to you until 5 p.m.
That leads to another question from me. That question being, why can't the state fund every single kid in the state of New York, be able to get them a laptop? There's what the state does, I think, with this right now is just, it's not even been talked about or approached. Every student has the right to have that laptop to be able to do school virtually, like we're doing this show virtually, for example. And I don't even think it comes down to local funding. To me, that should be something the state education department does and make sure that every kid in this state has what they need at home if we are going mostly virtual, like we did, obviously, during the late spring and into the end of the school year, and what we're going to have to do in most areas in September.
I agree with you, and one of the things that I advocated for right before I left the Yonkers City Council. I served on the City Council for 6 years before being elected to the county board. One of the very last things, and unfortunately I wasn't able to continue the conversation, was to make sure that every student had a tablet that they could take home. But then there's the additional fact, even if we did do that, we need to make sure that every household has Wi-Fi. And I think, and I know that at the county, I've talked to several of my colleagues about how when developers come in before us from now on, we need to make sure that they treat Wi-Fi as a utility. The same way we treat electricity, the same way we treat water, is the same way we need to treat internet access from now on.
We're joined by Christopher Johnson, 16th District, County Legislator, City of Yonkers, here on Westchester Talk Radio. I'm John Marino, produced by Sharc, Sharc Creative, and we are brought to you in part by made possible by our good friends at places like White Plains Hospital. At White Plains Hospital, we thank all of our heroes there. and all the frontline workers throughout the COVID-19 pandemic for all they have done and continue to do. Wartburg Rehabilitation, Healthcare in Mount Vernon, Park Sterling Realty in Bronxville, and Michael Labriola, Landscape Design and Construction. Christopher Johnson, other issues that have afflicted communities for decades, and we don't see an end in sight to now. I'm going to preface this and say, I grew up in East Harlem, and I grew up in the 70s, the heyday of the gangs of the 70s. And we saw that kind of peter out as we got into the 80s. We hit the 90s, gangs weren't the problem they had been. And then the late 90s came, and everything started up all over again. And we see this big spike, this increase in gun violence the last few months. Everybody's been locked indoors. They want to get out. Some people may have a beef to settle with somebody else, and this seems to be the way to do it. How do we hit the problem of gang violence? How do we make young people understand you don't need to do this as I was taught when I was 16 years old?
So the same way we talked about, the previous issues, we have to look at the root problem. Oftentimes, why does someone join a gang? And it's because they don't feel like they belong. They don't have that person, those people to connect to. So that goes back to our conversation about mental health, right? And having access and people feeling like they can actually cope with what issues they're going to, and that they actually do belong in the society that we've built. But then it goes on to, because there's nothing wrong with being in a group, right? That is, right. That you feel will protect you, that you feel has the same ideals that you have. That's actually
everybody hung out with somebody, with a clique. Right.
Exactly.
And what's a clique? It's a gang of sorts, no matter what you do or don't do.
Exactly. I'm in a gang. It's the county board of the Westchester County Board of Legislators.
Right. That's the clique that runs the county, right? At least to a good extent, partially.
Exactly. Well, we try to do good anyway.
Right. We try. Right.
Mm-hmm. The problem comes when that becomes violent, right?
Right.
And when people's ideologies or a group's ideologies intersect negatively with another group, and they physically show those disagreements. And so part of that has to do with what people have and what people have access to, right? And so unfortunately, again, we're in a society of the haves and have-nots. And when you don't have anything, you find the smallest things to hold on to. And so if I hold on to this really small thing like a corner, and then you have this really small thing like the corner across the street,
right,
and they come to a head, what we need to do is make sure that these young people have, as I said, the mental health and feeling and need of belonging, and then access to education, and then they need to get educated so that they can get jobs. Because when you have a job that actually pays you well, then you can have things, and you don't have to fight other people over those things, right?
Right, and it takes you off the street too if you have a job.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, and then you're more effective, and then the place you hang out changes too, right?
Right.
You no longer hang out on the corner because you happen to live in a situation that is cramped and overcrowded. Now you hang out in my backyard.
Right.
And so now, because we're all in the backyard, we don't come across the people that are walking by us, and nobody, bumps into me or any of those small things that turn into big interactions. It is really at the root, unfortunately, simple, as difficult as it is to, actually implement. The idea is simple.
It is simple. All of this is simple. I can think back to times in the 70s where be gathered around somebody and come up to one of the guys, come up and say, no, this happened, that happened. And we set a rumble for tomorrow night at 7:30. And it's like, we're going to rumble over this. I mean, you got to be kidding. No. We got to do it. And I'd always try to be the guy, I thought I was more of a lover than a fighter, probably maybe neither, but I'd be the guy to jump in and say, who do we got to talk to settle this before something serious really happens? Why can't we get our young people today to realize this? Let's sit down and talk and work it out. That guy's your brother. He's not your enemy. He's not somebody who's looking to bring you down. You're trying to get to the same place. Why not work together to get to that place?
It's tough because do we have those examples? It's really hard to, live the life of do as I say, not as I do. And young people, they don't care about what you say. They watch you, they pay attention. And so if they see, as an example, our current president, right? If the answer is, when you disagree with someone, to tweet in all caps and to tell lies and to make up stories, then it becomes extremely difficult to tell our young people that's not the way to do it. It's extremely difficult to tell our young people, like, you need to do all the fact checking, read 5 articles, and make sure that they come from good sources before you express your deep opinion on an issue, when it's easier to create a meme and just say, look, this meme said so. And so if we live in a society that is like instant gratification, we need this right now, the easiest way to get that is by force. And it is sad and it is unfortunate, but that's what young people will turn to.
Now, this summer affected by the pandemic, by COVID, we have not been able to utilize all the different youth programs around the county to keep people off the streets. How can we, knowing the effects of COVID on the county budget, on the state budget, how can we reinstitute a really effective model of giving kids something to do, not only during summertime, but after school, during school, when they have a free period, etc. I remember when midnight basketball was instituted a good 25, 30 years ago, and I get into discussions with athletic people around Westchester about the need to do this. You had guys like Lowe's Moore, the former net over in Mount Vernon, everything he's done in Mount Vernon with the Boys and Girls Club. I remember having discussions with him about it through the years. At one point he said to me, he said, keep getting everybody to go to midnight basketball. And I would tell people, this keeps kids off the street. It doesn't matter if it's midnight, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. They got something to do. And if they're up till 4 or 5 a.m. playing ball, well, they can sleep later and not get in trouble the next day if trouble is something that they might get into.
Absolutely. It's going to be difficult, but I think this is the crossroads where you really see what your priorities are. I often hear advocates say that our budget is a moral document. And so as you craft a budget, you're looking at the things that you really find valuable. You're looking at the things that you believe ethically you need to actually perform and respond to, and that is actually your charge as the government to provide to individuals. So I think as we move forward, we're going to have massive challenges because of COVID, because what it's done to sales tax, what it's done to people being able to pay their rent, to property owners, and then property owners pay their taxes. It is really going to be extremely difficult for us to work through this. But as we make those difficult decisions, our priorities are are going to show. People are going to see. It is easy to, during good times, to say you love everybody and to make sure everybody is fed. But when times are tough, like they will be, like we will continue to see, this is where rubber is going to meet the road.
Here on Westchester Talk Radio, joined by Christopher Johnson, County Legislator, 16th District, City of Yonkers. I want to go back to an educational point even one more time. The state is considering, and we seem to have people who are involved in the salon business trying to, and you talk about educational equity and fairness. Now, you go into a women's salon and some men's salons too. You get your hair washed, and it's usually an immigrant who's washing your hair. Somebody who's, there you go. Generally, I look like that. During the pandemic, I let it grow out a bit. So I haven't done that since maybe I was 15 or 16 and running around. But you look at this issue now and you talk about how the state may want to, they do want people who wash hairs, what they call shampoo assistants, to receive 500 hours of training, have to pay over $13,000 in order to get that. If you're an EMT, emergency medical technician in the state of New York, you need 120 to 150 hours of training. And as I said to somebody last night, lay back, I'll wash your hair. Do you think I need 500 hours of training to do that? Get whoever you want to cut it. And this is a female friend of mine out on Long Island. I said, I'll wash your hair. Get whoever you want to cut it. But you think I need 500 hours of training to do that? And you look at that and you say, who's zooming who?
It's difficult whenever you talk about the regulations that are placed on any type of industry, right? So what are the conversations that are going on? Who are the advocates on either side? And what do they tell you the reasons are for it, right? So on its face, it doesn't sound like one would need 500 hours. But are they able to work while they are receiving the licensure and getting that education? I don't know. It seems like, but and so many times in so many industries, some things, some regulations seem overburdensome, and this one might actually be that. But it's important that as we look to the safety of individuals who are, doing this, that the health aspect, especially in something like a hair salon, when someone is in close interaction with someone, and we're talking about COVID and all the health things that are happening right now in our societies, or globally. It's important for us to look at how we regulate each and every industry, but also do that cautiously, recognizing that, you can't ask someone who's going to be a low to minimum wage worker to pay, thousands of dollars to have a license to do, the work that we need to be done, honestly, essential work for so many things.
And that's not to say that there aren't health issues that when you wash somebody's hair, you have to be aware of. No doubt about that. But still, it's just the cost seems exorbitant and the amount of hours seems exorbitant too, especially when you look at the fact that EMTs need 120 to 150 hours, and to wash somebody's hair, 500. I think that you might have to reverse that if you wanted to be fair.
There's some evaluation that needs to take place.
Yeah, and this is an issue still to be worked out by the state, obviously. We talk about other issues that affect communities, and we touched upon it with gangs and somebody having a beef with somebody else and the spike in gun violence. My mother passed away in December, and in her final weeks, I'm sure I can tell by the things she was saying, the conversation she had, she figured she was probably nearing the end of her time on this earth. But in the last couple of weeks, she said to me 4 times, get the guns off the streets. 4 separate times, get the guns off the streets. How do we get the guns off the streets finally? I've always been a big proponent of the only people who need to have a gun are law enforcement and the military. Now, I have friends who are libertarians who say, okay, so you don't have a gun, the government can do whatever. Nobody has a gun, the government can march in on everybody and do what they want, and you have no protection. And yet we got to look at things like what's going on the streets. We have the iron pipeline from the south to here. How do we cut things like this off? I think if we solve the gun problem, we'll solve much of what goes on in so many different communities.
Well, I would respond to your libertarian friend by saying the government also has tanks. So you can have guns, but the government has tanks.
They do no good against a tank, right? Okay, right.
So I think we'll still be a little bit outmatched there.
We still have to get the guns off the streets regardless.
Yeah.
That'll solve so much.
But what we have to do, what we see so often, right, is that legal gun owners are often responsible. They often understand that their weapons should be locked up and stored in a safe place. But we still see the tragedy of if there's a gun in a home with a child, it is the opportunity and the reality that child may die from a gun is elevated, unfortunately. But there's still that element of responsible gun ownership that I'm fully supportive of. However, what we're seeing oftentimes with these guns that are on the street is that they're illegal and that they come from southern states. And I think I'm not a fan of Mike Bloomberg for the most part, but I will give him credit here in that he was extremely valuable in bringing that to the conversation with regard to New York City, making sure that guns from out of state, from southern states, that we paid attention to that, and that was stored as much as possible. And I think that's the conversation that we need to have. But unfortunately, that's a national conversation that needs to take place, because you can't stop every car from coming into New York and do a check and say, do you have a gun? Do you have a weapon? And do you have a license for that? It's the biggest difficulty that we're going to have in this specific situation.
I've always thought we should have a national gun policy, gun program, that the laws about guns should be the same in every state. Sometimes you see stories about people who come here from states in the South or the Midwest where gun laws are a lot less lax than they are here, and they get busted for carrying a gun. And some of these people, you believe them, you do, maybe you don't. Though I didn't know in New York, this is what the gun laws were here. I didn't know that because I'm not registered in New York, I can't carry it here. I can't come into the state with it. And as they say, ignorance is not an excuse.
Exactly.
But if we had one uniform policy across the country, the same gun laws in every state, we wouldn't see somebody go from one state to another and get in trouble for something that's legal in their own home state.
Right. And so, you know, in a lot of cases, this is a difficult conversation to have because states are different, communities are different, you know, rural areas to suburban to urban areas. But when you talk about gun ownership, that's a place where we probably could have a national standard about what's acceptable, excuse me, and what's not acceptable. And so I agree with you.
I remember as a kid, like I said, growing up in East Harlem, we lived in the projects and things happened. And I said to my father one day, I must have been about 10 years old, "Hey, Pop, why don't we get a gun?" He looked in my face. He got down in my face and he said, "Yeah." He said, "Think you know how to use it? You think we know how to use it around here?" He said, "Never get a gun." He said, "Never, ever, ever. No one should have a gun unless you know how to use it and you know what you're doing step by step with it." And I saw throughout my life how his words proved out through the years. And about 10 years ago, I went to him and I thought about that incident, recalled it for him. And he said, "You see, I told you back then, like in 1968, 69. And you see, through the years, all these incidents happened with people who didn't know how to use a gun and the trouble they got into because of that, because they had good intentions, but it ended up the wrong way because they had no idea what they were doing."
Right.
Also, too, the effect of the COVID pandemic. Let's talk about that. On communities of color, on all communities, on society in general throughout our region here in the tri-state area, and of course, too, throughout the country, but specifically in this area.
So unfortunately, what we've seen is communities of color, urban communities have been have been disproportionately affected by COVID. In addition, communities of color and people of color have died at higher rates than other communities. And that's something that we need to look at and pay attention to, and we need to push back on. We need to make sure that health services are available in these communities, that people understand the need to wear a mask, to social distance, to follow all of the suggestions by our health experts, to believe science, to understand that the reality is when our health officials tell us that this is the best way to thwart the disease, that we follow their instructions.
Now, I think one issue, too, that's a big part of this, and we talked about homelessness before, finding maybe it might be tough for certain families, a lot of families, obviously difficult for them to find housing where people can space out. So if you live in, and I read a story about a Dominican family in Washington Heights early on in the pandemic who were 11 people cramped into an apartment. One person had COVID in the apartment. I don't think it passed to everybody else, but the precautions they took when that one person would come out of her room and say, "I'm coming out now, I'm going to use the bathroom," and everybody go lock themselves in a different room. And that's no way to live. And that's the easiest way how it spread like this, because of people being in substandard housing, being cramped in, and they had nowhere to go. But COVID doesn't need really far to go. All it has to be is from here to here, less than 6 feet apart, even maybe more than 6 feet apart. Right. I'm a big believer that it floats in the air. How could so many people have been infected without it floating and remaining in the air? So that's why it's so important to mask up, et cetera, and take the precautions we take.
Yeah, that sneeze that I just did definitely would have traveled more than 6 feet had I not covered my face.
How could so many people be infected if it didn't linger in the air for a longer period of time? That's just my opinion. I'm not a scientist. I was never really into science, but I think it's more a matter of just so many people got sick. How could this be?
Well, I think to your point, that one household, and if it didn't spread, God bless them, because that is the most difficult situation it could be. Right. Because that person stays in that room, and so no one else has access to that room for at least 14 days. And when they come out of that room and go to the bathroom, then all of the cleaning that needs to take place for the bathroom, right? The doorknobs, the toilet handle.
Right. As she talked about, too, so much extra work for her, and she was the one who was sick.
Right. And it's it really is. So I'm glad that at the county level, we were able to make sure that we provided hotel rooms in those instances where families were in that situation where they could not social distance, where if someone tested positive, they were able to get a hotel room. And we monitored them throughout the day, not just like a once a day check, because God forbid somebody has an episode at 8 p.m. and you're not checking on them until 8 a.m. So we were able to have regular checkups. Are you okay? How's it going? And so we had those opportunities. Now, I don't think everyone knew about it. And so everyone wasn't able to take advantage of it. And that's part of the unfortunate part of just like having such a large society and being involved in a pandemic. How do you get that information shared? How do you pass it from one household to another and make sure that everyone has equitable access to the information and to the shared resources that are available?
Final segment with County Legislator Christopher Johnson, 16th District, City of Yonkers, here on Westchester Talk Radio, westchestertalkradio.com. I'm John Marino. Christopher Johnson, how do we effectively reform police departments? The governor put out a mandate about 6 weeks ago. He wants every municipality, locality, hamlet, village, city around the state to present to him a plan for effective police reform within the next few months. He says if you don't do this, this could affect the money you get in your locality from the state. How do we effectively reform police? I'm going to go back to the George Floyd incident, and you look at what happened there, and the thing that strikes me about that is the cop, Derek Chauvin, didn't he realize, and he's got to know this, that everything we do today is on a camera. Everything can be posted on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, on all kinds of different chats, etc. How could he even think about doing what he did knowing the whole world would see?
In addition to the fact that he had a camera on his chest.
Yeah, in addition to that, too, that he had a police camera, too. Like I said, everything he's doing besides the police camera, cameras all around him, too. And also, too, you look back at the beginning of the incident where they say George Floyd seemingly may have passed a $20 counterfeit bill. The one question I've never heard asked was, okay, did he know it was counterfeit? You can walk into a store. I walked in, and this has happened coming out of the same bank twice now in my area in the last year. It happened a year ago, and it happened last week. I went into the bank, got some cash, went into a store, took one of the bills from the bank, and they're holding it up, looking at it. And I remember a year ago I said, I think I'd better say this. You know, it's fresh out of the bank down the block here. I just got it. I was about to say it a week ago, too, when they said, okay, it's good. So if you can't trust the money you get out of a bank and walk into a store right away, how would you possibly know a bill is counterfeit?
Yeah, in that circumstance, you almost got no chance. But I do want to say that I'm glad that, obviously I knew when we're talking social justice, we were going to get to police reform.
Right.
But I'm glad that we had the opportunity to really discuss so many other issues before getting here, because social justice issues do not just revolve around, reforming our police. But a lot of stuff needs to be done. I don't understand how we are still in a society where we have individuals that have all this power and that they feel that they can abuse it. Now, I mean, people say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but there really needs to be accountability. And the reality is we look for, all those people who say there are good cops out there. We look for the good cops to stand up to the bad cops. And so unfortunately, the other three individuals, right, the other three police officers may be good people and may have had good records, but what they did not do was stand up to that one evil actor.
Right.
Because they didn't stand up to him, there is a man that is dead. And so they are complicit in that action. And so I think what police officers throughout the country need to understand is that when you do not stand up to bad actors, you are complicit in their bad action. I'm excited that the governor has tasked every community throughout the state of New York to really look at, how policing in our communities. It's unfortunate that he even had to put that upon us. I think every community should have started looking at that right away, whether or not the governor said so. I think we need to go beyond cameras, though. There is definitely a culture within our police departments. There are cultures everywhere, right? You work in an office. There's a culture in your office.
Well, your own office culture of your company.
Absolutely.
That's it.
And so there is a culture in our policing in this nation where they protect one another. And it's unfortunate because their job is not to protect one another. Their job is to protect the public. And so we need to make sure that is their first priority, first and foremost, and that they are, pushing back on bad actors. I think that there needs to be a movement on the state level here in New York to make sure that our departments are diverse. The city of Yonkers is about 17% Black, and the police force currently is 4% Black. In the history of the Yonkers Police Department, there have been less than 100 Black police officers, there are currently more than 600 police officers on the force. Those numbers don't add up. Westchester County's police force, which mostly polices our highways. We also have some school resource officers, as well as we do Mount Kisco's actual policing. But we have 75% of our police officers are white men. There are very few women. There are very few people of color. And if we don't have that diversity, then you don't have an understanding of the people that you're serving. And if you don't understand,
do we need to have different training for cops too? When you talk about those kind of numbers, that maybe before you become a cop or as you become a cop, part of the training, you're brought into areas you're not familiar with to learn about the people and figure out that maybe here I might have to do some things a bit different.
Yeah, and so training is a part of that, and training then becomes ongoing, right? Because communities change, ideals change, language changes. So something that someone said to you 10 years ago might have been bad, but right. You hear it 10 years later, and it might be a compliment. And right. If you don't know that because you haven't been retrained, you may react, in a negative manner. But the reality is, if your partner understands the community or comes from that community, then they can kind of give you that guidance, right? If your captain, understands that community, they can tell you these are the things that you need to look out for because this holiday is coming up, and this is how people celebrate, and this is the attitude that you expect to come from people. Or so-and-so in this community, was a big name and they passed away on this day. So as you interact with people from that community today, understand that they'll be grieving. Like little things like that really change the way police officers interact with people on a daily basis. And if we're not paying attention to those things, then we're not paying attention to the completeness of society.
You talked about the other officers in the George Floyd incident who stood around. And I hate to say this, but they have to live with that forever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they should also, they're also going to be held responsible, accountable for those actions. Absolutely. And they should be.
Without a doubt. And you see the way some of them are talking, certain statements that have leaked out where they have remorse now. But like you said, if you're a good cop in this situation, you got to step up and grab your buddy, grab your partner and say, hey, stop, that's enough. Or, hey, we shouldn't be doing this. Let's do what we were supposed to do as trained police officers. If we have to take somebody in, let's do it the right way, and then we can figure the rest out.
We talked earlier in this conversation about how we expect young people to react in certain situations. And I tell, people I'm close to, and now I'm telling the whole public, that I think that life is oftentimes an extension of high school. And so when we're in high school, right, we often succumb to peer pressure. And so the person who we think is cool, or the person we think has the power and influence, we will often just succumb to whatever they say we're supposed to. And so in this situation, we saw a police officer who was the head of that situation. And then we saw 3 of his peers succumb to the pressure. And so what we need to do, not only to young people, but we need to empower each other as adults, as a society, to step up and to stand up when we see people doing things that are wrong, including our colleagues, including our superiors, which is extremely difficult.
As they say, we all have to work together to make a difference. And it's a simple statement, but that's what it comes down to.
Right.
Christopher Johnson, City of Yonkers, Westchester County Board of Legislators, 16th District in the City of Yonkers. We thank you for being part of our social justice and police reform conversation here today on Westchester Talk Radio. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me. Black Lives Matter.
And thank you for all you do. And say hello to our good friend Jovan Richards over in New Rochelle, too. Thank you. Christopher Johnson here on Westchester Talk Radio. I'm John Marino, WestchesterTalkRadio.com. And we are made possible by our good friends over at Entergy, the Indian Point Energy Center in Buchanan. Right through April of 2021, they promised to keep powering us up right here in Westchester. Lipolis Electric over at Lipolis. They say, don't be left in the dark. Get Lipolis. Hightower, Westchester, managing your wealth to a fiduciary standard. Over at White Plains Hospital, we say thank you to our heroes there and all the frontline workers throughout the COVID pandemic. Wartburg Healthcare and Rehabilitation in Mount Vernon, we thank you as well. Also Park Sterling Realty in Bronxville, and Michael Labriola Landscape Design and construction. We are Westchester Talk Radio, westchestertalkradio.com. Catch all of our programming on our YouTube channel, Sharc Creative YouTube.